to World War Now, everybody. I'm your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalyagan, coming here with a huge show. I'm back from a brief hiatus. GSP was filling in for me on our 75th episode, so I can't believe I missed our big milestone, 75 episodes of World War Now. We've got over 40 episodes of Ether Hours, so 100 plus shows here with Dmitry. Pretty exciting stuff. But this week, we're going to be talking about stuff, I guess, from the past 10 days, even because I've been gone, catching up on some things. I missed the death of the Iranian president, but now we're going to be talking about the imminent Israeli invasion of Lebanon, the situation in the Israeli cabinet, as well as the escalations all along the Russian front lines, the rumors of this Sumy offensive, China-Taiwan really heating up even more so since Dmitry and GSP discussed it on the show. We're going to be talking about Hezbollah's responses and their escalations on Kiryat Shmona and the Golan Heights and all of these other things, as well as our good friend Lucas Gage getting, not raided, but getting visits from the police. We also have Metropolitan Tikhon visiting Metropolitan Onufri in the Ukraine. So big developments on the church front. We're also going to be talking about Srpska potentially seceding from Bosnia soon in the Balkans, as well as the Georgia stuff, Trump's conviction. Really, I could just keep listing things here for 10 minutes if we just don't get into it. So big show. Dmitry, it's good to be back. How are you doing?
Doing great, Conrad, and hello to all the listeners. Yes, you did miss the 75th episode, but I'm sure you'll be here for our centenary episode 100, which I think will air sometime in 2024. Super excited for that. A lot to speak about this week. I think it's wise for us to begin in the Middle East, of course. The war in Lebanon has been heating up very intensely. Now, we call it the war in Lebanon because it definitely has already progressed past the Gazan Palestinian genocide, and Israel, of course, is making quite significant encroachments bombardment-wise onto Lebanese soil. We note that at least 455 people so far since October have been killed by Israeli bombings. That's already close to half a thousand. So, and there have been close to 5,000 bombs and just attacks by Israel since October 7th on Lebanese territory, particularly, of course, in southern Lebanon. But we do know Israel has been making these high-tech sorties out towards Syria as well, which, of course, is always significant. And, it was discussed, the tension between even Russian sharing airspace with this is Israeli Air Force offensively in Syria. I think that's a big deal. And definitely when we talk about black swan events, a possibility there. But Lebanon is definitely suffering, not as much as the Palestinians in Gaza, but the Lebanese peaceful civilians living in the south, they have this aura of not being sure as to what will take place. Israeli bombs could be dropping at any point, and of course, nobody will be held accountable. Nobody will answer for these destructive attacks of Israel on Lebanese soil, because they'll just say, well, we dropped a bomb on this particular house. That's because Hezbollah was stationed there, or this was some sort of storage facility for armaments of Hezbollah, who are apparently Iranian proxies now, which partially they are supported by Iran, but I would say Hezbollah is clearly a Lebanese initiative, right? It is a proper Lebanese party, and it is a power front. It is a Lebanese social, collective, like a unit on cohesion. So I just do know that Israel has been bombing Lebanon very intensely. So now that we see an escalation in the news, Conrad, it comes as no surprise, right? And just ratio-wise, Hezbollah itself has bombed Israel, as of today, over 1,100 times, right? So you can see that 5-to-1 ratio there, 5,000, 1,000. So it's clearly not equal. Israel does hold the, not only the planes that America has recently given it, but also the economic superiority. They do produce their own weapons locally, domestically, but they also receive shipments from abroad. Meanwhile, Hezbollah, I believe, hasn't even begun installing those anti-air missiles that Russia has given them, those missile anti-air setups. So again, technology-wise, I guess Hezbollah is severely undermanned, I think, and so it's very concerning. But naturally, in this southern Lebanese zone, we do have, close to 90,000, 100,000 people in the zone of risk, and these are mostly civilians who are now under threat of Israeli bombardment at any point. Will Israel, like in 2006 or years earlier, actually make an underground incursion via tanks and infantry onto Lebanese soil in order to, allegedly clear out some of these Hezbollah defensive strongpoints? We're not too sure. But again, you can't keep the illusion up that Hezbollah has been digging, and they've been having their own Surovikin defense lines similar to the Russians in Zaporozhye. They've been, they knew that eventually they would provoke Israel enough for Israel to invade southern Lebanon again. with its superior military force. And so I'm sure they've been setting up booby traps. They've been putting down trenches. They have a whole bunch of defensive bunker installations. It is, now that we're speaking about Normandy, in the news, you see that a lot of Normandy signaling. This will be the Lebanese sort of Normandy defense against the invading Israelis. So yeah, definitely a lot of conflict happening in southern Lebanon. So it is dragging our attention a little bit away from Rafah as well, given that Israel, of course, is still maraudering. I would say that's the only word we can use to describe the IDF's action in Rafah, and the depths have been quite extreme. I mean, since last week, Conrad, there's been that massive, the bombing of civilian tents where people were just burnt alive. That footage is, of course, horrible from Rafah, Gaza. So again, nothing's really been changing, nothing's been improving in that part of the world.
Now, the escalation is pretty continual and it's across the board. We remember from a while ago, the Houthis claimed that they struck the USS Eisenhower, one of the, or was it the Gerald Ford? I'm forgetting. They struck one of the aircraft carriers in the Red Sea. And while there has been no confirmation of that besides the claim from the Houthis, some kind of naval official posted what was supposed to be confirmation, of the aircraft carrier not being struck, but it was found by, internet people to be an old image. So if there really was no damage, why would they be needing to post old images? So the mystery still remains. I guess we should expect that if anything actually went outside of the plan of the US, Zog Navy, that they're not going to be honest and upfront about what really happened. So that makes sense. But the Houthis themselves, it's believed that they actually have new, either Iranian or at the very least Iranian inspired, and who gave them the tools and the ability to create these new solid fuel missiles that are able to strike again from Yemen all the way to Eilat and parts of Israel and others. They're upgrading their missile capabilities. And again, the Houthis, they've survived all of this bombardment that continues to this day from the UK, the US, and France. And they have proven that they are, the dominant power in Yemen, on the Arabian Peninsula. They can resist Saudi Arabia and the US empires. So they are here to stay, while Hezbollah, they are also dramatically escalating their missile strikes. They do have enormous missiles, much bigger even than the Houthis, that they, in theory, could level at all of the cities of Israel. But the main thing they've been doing is targeting Kiryat Shmona, which is the most northern settlement of Israel. Not really settlement, it's a city fully within Israel, but it's the most northern of the sort of major cities. It has, at one point, I thought, before the war, it had like 30,000 people. I'm sure that's shrunk. They've basically cut off all access to it, and the whole region around it is now engulfed in fires. The Hezbollah missiles have, ignited the landscape, basically, and now fires are spreading all throughout northern Israel. Firefighters are drastically fighting it. It's escalated very quickly. And since then, Israel has increased their airstrikes all over southern Lebanon. There have been reports of sonic booms and flights over Beirut, which we know that Israel has conducted flights over that since the beginning of their operation into Gaza. But the likelihood of this war escalating into Lebanon is very high. It did seem like at the beginning of this week that people were going to agree to the Biden ceasefire, which had come up. But, basically what happened was, after it was announced publicly, Netanyahu and the Israelis were like, they lied about the agreement. This wasn't what we said. And that, then Biden says, I guess the Israelis never actually agreed. And then even in the midst of this, including the Lebanon stuff, Smotrich, Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister, then the national defense minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, they threatened to, quit the cabinet, leave the united war government if the ceasefire is agreed to. And they're also claiming to do that if a war doesn't happen in Lebanon. Meanwhile, Benny Gantz, the leader of the more moderate faction that is allied with Netanyahu for this, wartime emergency, government that's been ruling now for the past 6, 7, 8 months, he says that he's going to leave if they don't, take something akin to the ceasefire deal. So Israel very divided, Netanyahu caught in the middle of all of it. He's the only one that has the largest personal following to be able to be like a kingmaker. But Itamar Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, they've been in Kiryat Shmona on the border with Lebanon, calling for Israel to go in and wipe out Hezbollah, saying Lebanon has to bleed, Lebanon has to burn, openly calling for it. The silly, silly prime minister of Lebanon, who is becoming more, who I'm convinced is a patsy for Israel more and more every day. The Maronite Christian community in Lebanon not doing the work right now. They're saying that we're getting no signals of an impending Israeli, invasion in the south. It's like, well, you're going to get caught with your pants down then, because I'm pretty sure it's clearly going to happen at this point. We are again seeing, like you said, the Rafah assaults, children dying, the entire Philadelphia corridor that Egypt said was a total red line for Israel has now completely been taken by Israel. So good job, Egypt. Your red lines clearly mean a lot. But Israel, they're kind of just getting their way right now. And Biden did tell them that an invasion of Lebanon would probably lead to a direct Iranian response, and the implication being that the U.S. wouldn't help them with that. But again, this all goes to what I've been saying. With Trump, he is going to probably get elected president here again in another, 5 months, however long it is. And then when he gets in there, he'll have done it with money from Miriam Adelson, who said that she wants to give him money on the condition that they allow the Israelis to annex the West Bank and completely recognize, at least a mini version of Greater Israel. And so whatever Biden says about intervention is kind of irrelevant because Trump's going to get in there and he totally would intervene on behalf of Israel against Iran if Israel did some stupid nonsense in Lebanon. So World War III is here, people, and it's about to really escalate between Israel, Iran, the United States, in Lebanon. Hezbollah is going to be caught in the middle. The Houthis are going to be there. And I don't see how that doesn't bring in Azerbaijan and ultimately perhaps even Russia and the Ukrainians and everything going on there. This might really link these fronts. So World War really is now. But Dimitri, I want to know your thoughts on where the next flashpoint specifically is going to be. Do you think it's going to be this Israeli-Lebanon invasion? Do you think the government and the cabinet collapses before that happens? Do you think Netanyahu stays? I really think that the timing on this with the election is shaping up to be exactly as I suspected, that the Jews are going to steal it for Trump and he's going to come in and save them. But there's obviously also the Turkish-Azerbaijani angle as well.
Yeah, naturally. I think some analysis, yeah, is definitely required because these news really, I think, to the average listener, not, of course, a listener of World War Now, they simply wouldn't make sense. They're just looking at the Middle East as this big pot of chaos, which I'm sure it is a cauldron of confusion for a lot of people. But let's try to bring some sense into it. Well, allegedly, it is Pride Month. Tel Aviv is the gayest city on earth, as the Jews claim themselves. So we do need to explained that perhaps the protesting has died down, at least on paper, although there is barely any reporting of the Israeli protests, at least in the last week. Well, we can assume that they're still protesting, and whoever rides this Maidan wave, whether it's Gantz, Gallant, or of course maybe somebody inside like Smotrich or Ben Gvir rise up against Netanyahu, right? Even internally, perhaps they could seek to utilize that sort of fire from the demographic majority of protesters on the streets and sort of rise up to prominence. But it does seem like something does unite the Israeli elite. Perhaps it's the dark magic rituals which they conduct, and perhaps it's just their obsession with killing Palestinians. But there is this weird unity, right, at the top. Although, of course, there's infighting, similar to how the Bolsheviks back in the day were infighting amongst themselves. You had Sverdlov, Trotsky, Bronstein, Zinoviev, Stalin, Lenin. They all had their own sort of ideas of how to take enough power for themselves and sort of cut off a larger piece. So I'm sure that it's the same with Israeli Zionist elites. We shouldn't think that they're all conjoined and joined at the hip here. But yeah, there's definitely a lot of weird tensions happening. Not only is there the LGBTQ angle in Israeli society, which is completely foreign to the Palestinian Muslims and Christians, but also you have the radical rabbinical settlers who, on the 14th of May, just a bit more than 2 weeks ago, raided the Al-Aqsa Mosque with waving Israeli flags, wearing little white kippas, and it was it was definitely dispersed by police, Israeli police quite hesitantly, but the ability of these Israelis to radicalize, hundreds, this was half a thousand people, 500 people at the time, the ability for them to radicalize these mobs could lead potentially not just to Islamic pogroms in Jerusalem and some of these other cities, especially in the West Bank, but Potentially Christian pogroms afterwards, especially if any Christian country in Europe turns against, let's just say, Talmudic Zog power. So we do have to consider that Israeli attitudes towards Christians are only moderate insofar as they control Christian countries in Europe and they control the agenda. The reins are in their hands. The Mashiach, the so-called spiritual Shekinah Mashiach drives this particular European chariot. Okay, so they're in control, and thus they're trying to not bully Christians as much in the Middle East. But Muslims are definitely it's an open game for them, and hence we see these massive, scary crowds of radicalized Talmudic Jews, raiding Muslim, I suppose, holy places. You can say that in their particular perspective. So it's really quite scary. And of course, Conrad, I think this Lebanese confrontation, what it definitely does for us is, on one hand, it diverts the eyes of the world from Rafah, from Gaza, from all those crimes that have been committed. On the other hand, Hezbollah is a lot closer linked, even according to their own, sort of speeches, they are a lot closer linked to Iran. And so thus you can make that connection again. Unlike Hamas, which definitely had almost no, I mean, they're an entirely different religious branch of Islam to Iran, to the Shia Muslims. So it's completely unrelated. But with Hezbollah, you can make that connection. You can demonize them a lot easier. And thus, if Israel provokes that war with southern Lebanon, with that, and mind you, Hezbollah controls like 40% of Lebanese society, like in terms of it has at least that support. It's not just the radical party. It's not even like Hamas. It's completely different. It's a lot more of a cultural move. There are like literally civilians supporting Hezbollah in a lot greater capacity than there are, say, average Palestinians supporting Hamas, I would say. But Hamas, now that Hamas has kind of died down, their sort of ire has been done away with, and because the 7th of October radical, I would say, news sprees comparing it to the Holocaust have kind of killed their ire. Now Israel needs to turn towards Hezbollah. Perhaps if Hezbollah becomes really radicalized and does bomb a certain civilian site of Israel, maybe they can create a second, or shall we say a third Holocaust, a second 7th of October, in order to push Israeli society and call for a total war against Lebanon, or at least against Hezbollah and naturally the Lebanese people. So but also it drags the attention, right? This northern war of Israel drags the attention of the public, of mass media, of the world away from what they will be doing to the Palestinians of Gaza, because it's not just bombing them into oblivion. I agree with Alex Jones and some of these other more conspiratorial analysts and political commentators, even in Russia itself, like Maxim Shevchenko has mentioned that what they would potentially do to at least a few 100,000, if not million Palestinians, would to push them towards the sea, isolate them, move them away from Egypt, move them towards the Mediterranean, and naturally via these new piers which they're building, this first pier, but of course there could be many more, they will ship them off to Europe or, God forbid, the United States. This could be an exodus, a forced exodus project to get the Palestinians off of their native homeland. Of course, it's diabolical because not only will it cause unrest, and we know what Middle Eastern immigrants, not saying Palestinians in particular, but we know what displaced Middle Eastern immigrants do in European countries. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. But also in the US, it'll upset native Europeans, native white people. It'll also confuse, order out of chaos will be constructed here. And Gaza will be cleared for whatever project they have, whatever oil, gas in the fields of Leviathan, that oil, gas fields in the Eastern Mediterranean, whatever projects the Israeli Zionists have for that particular area will be exploited, right? We don't know what their plans are for Gaza. Really, these people have probably far-reaching ideas spanning decades, if not centuries into the future. But yeah, I think that's primarily the analysis. So we do need to seek, and we do need to see and look forward to, I suppose, at least expect a war between Lebanon and Israel, I think, in the near future. And also, I would add, Conrad, for people who think this is just another skirmish, right, on the northern border, remember all the news about Iran actually bombing Israel? That made, like, people were scared of World War III, but Iran killed, you could say through collateral, they killed one shepherd boy, right, in southern Israel. Hezbollah has killed already tens, if not maybe potentially hundreds of IDF troops, potentially even civilians through some of their bombardment tactics. And of course, they're retaliatory. So I'm not saying they're justified, but this is understandable. It's a wartime casualty. But Hezbollah has already taken more Israeli lives than Iran has. And so it is a very real conflict. We need to not only take it seriously, but also listeners need to consider that, yes, there is something big happening in North Israel, and I don't think it'll be ignored. And no, Syria is not in a position to come help. And I think Russian hands are tied, especially based on this recent Putin interview. Putin is looking to have a very healthy relationship with both. And I've been following the Russian embassy in Israel, right? Russia is seeking to retrieve some of those last remaining hostages from Hamas. They're being held by Hamas in some sort of tunnels under Gaza. We're not even sure. But Russia is seeking to play the middleman here between the Muslim world and Israel. And I'm not sure if that'll be working, especially when Israel pushes north and takes out some of these major players in the axis of resistance, or at least attempts to take out Hezbollah. So I think that would be my brief analysis. And we'll see kind of how this plays out going into the middle of the year here, into June, July, and I suppose the summer.
Yeah, it's a really big situation all around. And you mentioned Putin and his situation with Syria, and how while they have been conducting strikes against ISIS resurgence and other nonsensical groups that have tried to use the chaos of the region against Assad, we are seeing the whole situation in Syria. It's not collapsing, but it's not great. We saw the Syrian Foreign Ministry release a message that apparently Assad's wife, who has had cancer, apparently she died, but then they immediately deleted it. So I don't think there's even been official confirmation of whether she's dead or alive. So keep the Assad family, I guess, in your prayers. And one of the main players that's developing, you mentioned Putin's speech, he talked about growing ties with Azerbaijan, which again, here on the show, we're not very happy with Russia siding with Azerbaijan effectively against Armenia. That's not a civilizational perspective we believe they should be having. But one of the biggest stories that happened while I was away was the SOCAR oil company building, which is the Azerbaijani state oil company. Their building was attacked in Turkey, and the Azerbaijani government came out and talked about how Turkey is a brother country, but Israel will always be their brother country. I'll read the quote. It says, "Attacking the building of the Azerbaijani oil company SOCAR is attacking Azerbaijan, and we cannot accept this. Turkey is a brother country, but Azerbaijan is both our Kaaba and Quds. Israel is our strategic ally. Relations with Israel cannot deteriorate because of any country. Azerbaijan cannot and will not be a party to the political conflict between Turkey and Israel." That was from Ahmet Shahroglu, the head of the Azerbaijan Institute for Democracy and Human Rights. So this is somebody who's clearly afraid of getting caught up in the crosswinds between the fact that the average Turkish person hates Israel and Israel is starting to dislike Turkey. Again, we've discussed the fact that Turkey is still basically conducting trade with Azerbaijan and the government itself. If it wasn't for their specific connection with Hamas, who knows how much they would even be siding against Israel to begin with. But like Dimitri said, Hamas, they're not as connected to the Shia axis of resistance, despite the fact that they're like the main center of resistance right now. But the Turks probably have the closest connection, being the only major Islamic power that still has a system resembling or at all sympathetic to the Muslim Brotherhood. But the Turkey-Azerbaijan situation, again, is super fascinating because that's the bridge. The Turkic belt is what bridges, these Middle Eastern, Muslim, Arab, Persian, Jewish, Rum conflicts. The Caucasian Turkish belt is what then bridges it with the Slavic world, the Orthodox Christian world up there. So what happens there is going to ultimately be what brings the rest of the world, the Northern Hemisphere and Europe, into this world war and makes it to where everybody realizes what's going on and not just people who, like us, listen to Metropolitan the Ovitos of Morfu. But the other realm that's really heating up is China, Taiwan, and we've seen extremely bellicose statements from Chinese officials, military officials, as well as the foreign ministry, their defense ministers. They have said, any attempt to disrupt the reunification of China will be met with, violent resistance. They say that anybody that tries to keep China and Taiwan separate they will be broken and destroyed, using all of this strong language. The classic saying, the China's last warning. They like to give a lot of last warnings that are never the last one. But yeah, I mean, he specifically says anyone who dares to separate Taiwan from China will be smashed into pieces and lead to their own destruction. That was Dong Jun, the Chinese national defense minister. But, ministers and defense leaders in Taiwan have also been saying that, they will fight, they will use all the methods at their disposal to resist Chinese reunification. The U.S. has claimed that they will assist the Taiwanese in all of that. So that's almost a U.S.-related Third World War front ready to get ignited, basically. But, China has still stood by Iran through all of these sanctions and everything. And I believe it's something that the UN or who was going to adopt this sort of specifically anti-Iranian measure, and the Chinese and the Russians are specifically standing up against it. So that axis, the BRICS axis, the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement, getting stronger than ever. But Dimitri, you've been noticing what's going on as well down in the Philippines, because the Chinese government made a statement recently that we have never violated the territorial waters of another country, meaning that they believe that everywhere that their boats have been is Chinese territorial waters, which, you know, they're getting pretty close to some of these other countries. So pretty bold claim.
Yeah, it's really quite crazy what's happening in the South China Sea, and I mean everywhere in the eastern, I would say East Asian in these waters territorially. I mean, it's been a crazy place for thousands of years historically. If you look at it, these people have been battling it out with boats way before the Europeans have arrived, and naturally there've been disputes over some of these key islands. And of course, we're talking about the second Thomas Shoal, which is essentially one of the only overseas, you could say overseas, it's literally only 100 nautical miles away from the Philippines. So it's fairly close to the Philippines. In fact, it's closer to the Philippines than any other sort of set of islands. And it does have a massive American aircraft carrier, which has been destroyed during World War II, or more like it was intentionally sunk there. So, of course, it has this weird World War II type debris, and it looks kind of sci-fi-ish that, there's a bunch of islands, there's World War II debris, and the Filipino Navy is building something on this little set of islands. Now, it looks quite pathetic from, I would say, a perspective of, well, if you look at some of these defensive bases built up by Israel as well as Russia, Ukraine, there's massive military moves, and you look at these pathetic little islands and the dispute is over them. But yes, China has the ability, with its billion-person population, to multitask and to be concerned even over the smallest speck of land. And so this particular island, only 100 nautical miles away from Philippines, apparently it's in disputed waters. It doesn't, many countries claim that they have control over it. And so China has been patrolling around this island, harassing the Filipino vessels, which, we spoke about this 3, 4 weeks ago. But naturally, the tensions are increasing, and the Philippines, they are looking to build something on this particular second Thomas Shoal. That's what this set of islands is called. It's quite a curious development. We also need to consider the fact that China, its navy, Conrad, in terms of pure vessel capacity, they do have close to 330 naval vessels all in all, with 3 aircraft carriers, but definitely the ability to spread. And naturally, China only is adjacent to one ocean, so it's concentrated around these waters. They have a fleet of 130 patrol boats, which are officially they're closely related to the navy, but they're not armed in a naval type fashion. But what these patrol boats can do, I mean, mind you, the Filipino Navy only has 90 naval vessels altogether. So the entire patrol fleet of China is bigger than the Navy of the Philippines. And these patrol ships, they have not just regular, probably small arms artillery, but also firearms for their personnel on these boats, 40 to 50 people per boat, but also they have the capacity to use these massive water hoses and harass Filipino, Vietnamese. And now we can even see Japanese vessels as well, because near Japan, Japanese ships have been sprayed by Chinese patrol boats. So China definitely has the capacity to harass some of its neighboring countries in this weird, we won't declare war type fashion. At the same time, naturally, the big development, of course, is not just around the Philippines, which is always a clear tension in the South China Sea, but about Taiwan, because on the 20th of May, we did see the inauguration of the new Taiwanese president, Lai Ching-li. And of course, Lai Ching-li is from the Democratic Progressive Party. As you can imagine, this is a very pro-American party. And the election in Taiwan, it's quite a spread of time, because it took place in end of January, and only on the 20th of May was he inaugurated. But what's interesting is this Progressive Party won by perhaps 6, maybe 7% of the vote in Taiwan. And this is the Nancy Pelosi Democrat, pro-Democrat, anti-China party. The second party, which received 33.5% of the vote, was the Kuomintang official Chiang Kai-shek descendant party, and actually descendants of Chiang Kai-shek himself. That's the Chinese national leader, the founder of Taiwan, I wouldn't say monarchist. This is a really, you could say, Napoleonic type of figure in China's history, who broke away from China and essentially gave Taiwan its, what it is today, this strange nationalistic liberal independence. This Kuomintang party, the second biggest party in Taiwan, is actually pro-China. So they were close to winning this election, and there were fears last year from the Democrat side and the liberals of the world that perhaps the Kuomintang would win the election, and the president the president of Taiwan would be a pro-Chinese president. But this did not take place, and now, naturally, under the leadership of Lai Ching-li, the Taiwanese people have again distanced themselves from this Chinese connection, which is why we see, I think, the Chinese rhetoric is escalating, because they realize another 6 years, another presidential term, Taiwan will not be engaging in close diplomacy with their homeland, right? And this is concerning. Naturally, I think a lot of us are under this bizarre illusion, and I even was under this illusion myself prior to reading a lot on Chinese history, that, well, we see Taiwan as this sort of, maybe in the battle between the Chinese reds and whites, like we view it for a Russian Civil War perspective, that Taiwan was a sort of Wrangel, Denikin Crimea, which actually managed to stay separated away from the red Bolshevik China. But this really isn't the case. Taiwan was initially anti-imperial, anti-monarchist, and its nationalism was very much based in this European French type post-revolutionary nationalism, tied very deeply to the democratic liberal republican ideas that we're going to elect our leaders, the sacred tradition of emperorship that China has held on to since literally Egyptian times, since like 2000, 3000 BC, since literally Noah got off the ark, has been abandoned by these people. So Taiwan, and this shouldn't come as a surprise, Taiwan, their constitutional courts, without much protest, passed gay marriage in 2019. Taiwan is not a monarchist country. None of its leading parties are monarchists, and even the Kuomintang, which is the nationalist party, they are democratic, liberal, and French revolutionary in spirit. Okay, perhaps you can say they're more like 1776 George Washington-esque Republicans, but they're still not monarchists. So this isn't. So Taiwan is not some sort of white army, semi-orthodox alternative to communist China. They're not. They're a weird relic of the past, which in the postmodern world is being disintegrated by the LGBTQ liberal American hegemonic world order. I think that's the reality. And I think China sees this too. And China, mind you, is progressing away from communism as we speak. Again, America's two faced attitude towards China and Taiwan is super ridiculous, Conrad. And it shows, the American elites are probably demonic, of course. So, of course, they lie to both sides. In 1979, they actually changed their diplomatic office from Taiwan to Beijing. So of course, America, began recognizing China as actually the People's Republic of China, the Chinese entity, in 1979, but still they continued to support Taiwan militarily. And the latest, of course, package of aid came in just this week, 300 million American dollars, your taxpayer dollars. You could say fiat printed by the Federal Reserve, but still American taxpayer dollars, which could have been given to the people of America to improve their lives. This was handed over to the Taiwanese in order for them to improve their aircraft, which is a massive factor, I think, in the current, sorties that the Chinese Air Force is doing over Taiwanese waters, offensively breaking their borders and sovereignty, which I think is a sign of power by the Chinese Air Force. But still, the Taiwanese, this $300 million will go towards fixing up these Taiwanese F-16s. Like we hear the word F-16 quite a lot. That's because Israel has American F-16s now, Taiwan has them, and Ukraine potentially is now confirmed going to get them as well. The question is, I'm sure Taiwanese Air Force pilots can fly F-16s, and I'm sure Israelis can too, but can the average Ukrainian? I'm not too sure about that. So that's the situation at the moment. Taiwan is trying to bolster up its Air Force in order to repel some of these Chinese aggressive moves over its territory and borders. But it doesn't look good for Taiwan and China in terms of their actual friendship and their relationship going forward, at least for this presidential term, because the Democratic Progressive Party has won the election. So it's actually quite negative, I think, overall, and it plays directly into the prophecies of the saints about World War III and the fact that there will be potentially a Pacific theater in this world war.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, the China factor is probably going to be the ultimate thing that brings the U.S. into this third world war. It could be Iran. That's probably the if it's going to be happening sooner rather than later, the U.S. will enter for this Iranian thing. But if it's going to happen maybe a little bit later, I think it might come with the Taiwanese intervention. But yeah, Bongbong Marcos, the Filipino president, he's really been trying to preserve that Thomas Shoal, that I don't even know, what is it, like 400 square yards probably of sand if you like piled it all on top of each other. But yeah, I mean, China's claiming this huge swath of sea. They claim that Japan will face terrible consequences if they intervene. North Korea's been launching missiles. When I was in Japan, North Korea did a missile launch, so that was quite interesting to be there. I was kind of in a rural part of that time, so I didn't hear any alarms, but apparently there were alarm systems going off in the south and even in other parts of the country. But yeah, the South Pacific, the Caucasus, the Eastern Mediterranean, it's all heating up. There's even stuff going on, Venezuela, Guyana, and all of that. Now, Russia is signing a lithium mining deal with Bolivia, so multipolarity has definitely come to South America, despite the fact that pro-Russian Lula is, pro-Ukraine and everything. I think the Russians should abandon that clown. But yeah, World War III is definitely here. But, speaking of Russia, we should discuss the frontline situation there, as rumors are that there's a Sumy offensive coming. Russia is amassing troops once again in Belgorod, Bryansk, some of these regions. We're even hearing chatter about Belarus again, even though Lukashenko has made it very clear, at least he personally doesn't want to enter into the war in any capacity, although it seems to be more focused on the border with Poland. There's a whole bunch of issues there with Poland declaring exercises, 90 miles from the border, and migrants getting poured over and killing Polish border guards and whatnot. But Dmitry, what is the ongoing situation on the front lines in Ukraine? Where is the heaviest fighting? We know the Donetsk region is always where the fighting is the heaviest, and I have seen that there's pushes in basically all directions on the front line. But even Odessa, they're running on generators at this point because all of the infrastructure and power to that city has even been struck at this point. The The big strikes from Russia are hitting everywhere. Lviv, every east, west, south, the whole country. And apparently, the Ukrainians have been given permission from America to use HIMARS and these other missiles on Belgorod and into Russian territory itself. So that is a big escalation. So what's the update?
Yeah, that is perhaps the biggest escalation we've seen since the war. I mean, taking away all of these terrorist acts taking place on Russian soil, which allegedly have been taking place with SBU support, and some of them have been proven to be, Ukrainian provocateurs and terrorists, and SBU planners, of course, conducting them. But yes, now that the Biden administration has given the green light to some of these essentially offensive acts by Ukraine, because Ukraine, mind you, the entire 2 years has been holding off on striking Russian territory, or you'll notice on a map, you're like, hold on, why can't Ukraine, for example, strike Russia into Bryansk through the forests of Sumy, or, for example, strike Belgorod? That's because the Ukrainian bravado and their sort of image as the defenders of their homeland was based on a reconquista of the eastern territories, right? Zaporozhye, Kherson, Donetsk, Lugansk. It wasn't based on a retaliatory strike against Russia, but now the green light has been lit. And I think this is a sign of desperation, but also a sign of we hear potential nuclear conflict. We do hear, all over the Russian news, they're talking about tactical nuclear strikes and what the outcomes could be. And a lot of the Russians agree right now. This is in Russian media, the patriotic Russians, not the ones who are like verbose and hyperbolic. They are claiming that no tactical nuclear strike should be used against even a large gathering of Ukrainian forces, because any tactical nuclear strike by Russia, although small and perhaps insignificant in terms of damage and what it can do to the environment, will turn the world against Russia, and perhaps there will be sanctions beyond those which we see at the moment from simply Western countries. If India stops buying Russian oil, as they've been doing, sort of disrespecting sanctions, if China, never gets back to Russia regarding Sila Sibiri 2, which is the Nord Stream 2 equivalent, which is a Russian massive gas pipeline, which still hasn't passed, by the way. And this is one of the main concerns of Putin's recent visit to China. He didn't manage to somehow get this Power of Siberia 2 pipeline signed off on. So China is holding back on this project of obtaining Russian gas for some reason. And mind you, it's I think 50 billion cubic meters in terms of gas transportation. It's about the size of Nord Stream 2, so it would be a massive win for Russia selling all of this gas. Mind you, at a discount to China still, but China did not sign off on it. So very concerning for Russia that the Chinese, for some reason, are hesitant. But any sort of anti-civilian action or something deadly by Russia against Ukraine would be met with very bad coverage internationally. Russia at the moment does have the moral high ground, despite what the Western media is saying in this conflict, especially based on most of these terrorist acts and now these strikes against Belgorod, which have resumed. Because we thought for a moment that the Kharkov offensive would perhaps distract Ukrainian artillery and these HIMARS and missiles from launching them at civilians located in Belgorod, but that wasn't the case. It only took a week and a half for Ukrainians to resume some of these criminal bombardments of these Russian cities situated right next to the Ukrainian border. Very unfortunate, because I have friends of friends who actually live in Belgorod right now, and it is definitely like almost a war city. Like, they are prepared. They have drills in schools. People hide under their desks. It is very much a World War II-esque type scenario over there. The war is very real. It isn't like Moscow or Tver or some of these other cities very deep in the Russian heartland. In Belgorod does feel like Donetsk and Lugansk did 8 years ago. Very unfortunate. And that's crazy. The fact that Russia is still holding on and remaining stoic and having these controlled pushes into Ukrainian territory, not overextending, not striking civilian targets, is very much, I think this plays into Russia's image as a Christian country. It's a passionless approach to warfare, which is how Christians should conduct themselves in conflict. Very passionless. You can see this in the helmets of Russian Christian soldiers in the past, Alexander Nevsky, in some of the movies, where it's just a passionless visage, like a poker face type silver mask that they would wear in battle. And this is reflected in Russia's pushes in the east, right? Because it's not just the Kharkovskoy Oblast, which is where Russia is progressing, but also eastwards. As we spoke with Andrei Afanasyev recently on our A4 episode, the Russians are in fact progressing quite heavily in the Donetsk Oblast. They're using these turtle tank designs, which are essentially tanking in the literal word sense of the word. They are absorbing these drone explosions. They're driving down these main roads westwards, of course, moving only maybe tens of meters per day, but they are progressing Russia's defensive sort of capacity, pushing the Ukrainians away from Donetsk. And the drones are exploding. Like literally, the tank moves 10 meters, and the Ukrainian suicide drone flies into it and explodes, but no damage is done because that outer shelling defends these turtle tanks, which look very peculiar. They're quite ugly, actually, but maybe this is what warfare has come to in the Skynet type age when we're fighting against robots. And we all saw that footage of the robot dog in China walking around with, carrying a machine gun. The future is going to look pretty crazy, I think, going forward. But yes, in Sumska Oblast, this is the main, point of conflict, and Russia has progressed. The city of Sumy, which is definitely divided from Russia by a very deep forest. There is a Russian long-range artillery bombardment of Ukrainian defensive positions there, and inevitably, at least the media in Ukraine is saying that the Sumska Oblast will be invaded by Russia, similar to the Kharkovska Oblast, headfirst. So the Russians will charge in, they'll go into these forests, they will drive the Ukrainians back. Perhaps they'll take the city of Sumy itself, which we hope, because the bishop of Sumy, the Orthodox bishop there, was facing quite deep persecution recently. The Orthodox community in Sumska Oblast has been harassed quite intensely for the last 2 years. So perhaps them becoming liberated is one of the goals or unspoken goals of the Russian side. In terms of the Kharkovska Oblast, the city of Volchansk, to which Zelensky passed this really expensive highway all the way from Kiev, is now being turned into a new Bakhmut, unfortunately, by the Ukrainians, who are given this weird command to defend Volchansk by any means necessary. It is the new Stalingrad. It is the new Bakhmut. You can say it's a new Avdiivka, and it's looking quite ugly. Fortunately, a lot of the civilians there have been evacuated already. So, but Volchansk is being bombarded. The Ukrainians are holding basically any piece of Volchansk they can get, which results in the Russians, of course, having to destroy a lot of the houses and homes located there. Of course, thankfully, they're all empty, so there's been almost no reported civilian casualties, but still Volchansk is being decimated by the Ukrainians simply holding it for some reason. So again, it's the tactic that Ukraine has been using of sending their troops into indefensible positions, badly defended, not fortified positions, and of course turning it into a meat grinder, a real mass death of, you could say, perhaps Orthodox adjacent Slavic Eastern European people, because a lot of these Ukrainian men in the military have been brainwashed. A lot of them, unfortunately, are not Orthodox Christian. And those who are probably surrender very quickly because, again, there is no moral high ground, and their conscience must be aching fighting for this particular satanic regime of Ukraine. So the Russians are making good progress, and there is a lot of news about the Sumska Oblast offensive, potentially taking place very soon. We hope so. Perhaps the Kharkovska Oblast was not enough. Belgorod is still being bombed. Ukrainians are now striking deep into Russian territory, and who knows, the Ukrainians may be flying these drones deeper into the heartland of Russia, past Belarus, past Bryansk, all the way towards Moscow. And just as they did in 2023 when we saw a drone explode over the Kremlin dome. Who knows what the Ukrainians are capable of at this point. These people are not just provocateurs, but their leaders, their government is very much driven by a non-Christian ethic.
I completely agree. And speaking of a non-Christian ethic, the persecutions have only increased. You talked with GSP about the Church of the Tithes and its destruction. Very tragic. We continue to see the legislation being pushed against the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and more violence. But in a bit of good news, we did see the Metropolitan of the Orthodox Church in America, which is autocephalous, so the primate Metropolitan Tikhon, whose seat is in Washington, D.C., he visited Ukraine. I believe he visited the Pochai of Lavra and concelebrated with Metropolitan Onufri, showing that the Orthodox Church in America fully supports him and stands against the schismatics and what the ecumenical patriarch is doing. So it was very positive to see. There were some interesting things going on. Obviously, he didn't then go on to Russia to concelebrate with the Russians, even though the OCA claims to also be in communion with them. He did go to Romania and is now, I think, still there, concelebrating with Romanians. I don't know what is planned for the rest of the trip. Maybe I should have read up on that. But nonetheless, it's good to see. It was a brave thing to do. The Ukrainian authorities could have done something. I'm sure they probably realized that wouldn't be a good look, and the U.S. authorities were probably like, hey, man, you probably don't want to do this. But who knows? They might have felt ballsy. Who knows if any specific authorities were on guard that day, if they may have decided they wanted to do something radical. But it was good to see. I believe Metropolitan Onufri gave Metropolitan Tikhon a icon of all of the saints who shone forth in North America. So very good to see. We're also hearing news about, Zelensky losing more and more support. So obviously, I don't think anything close to a alternative regime has been produced, but we're seeing arrest warrants being put out for Yulia Tymoshenko, another former president. I don't know what the situation is with Poroshenko, but perhaps the Russians are cleaning up certain loose ends and plan on, revealing who they want to be the leaders of a, independent Ukraine, I guess you could say, or at least in Kiev, depending on what Ukraine looks like at the end of all of this. But what do you think about the Khan celebration, Dimitri? I'm wondering your thoughts on the visitation of Metropolitan Tikhon.
I think it's a huge victory for those who've been fighting for not just the OCA, because the OCA has been received by the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Metropolitan Onufry and Russia. It's sort of was received as an equal, right? And OCA still fights, unfortunately, in the world for recognition because the EP really doesn't recognize its autocephaly, primarily, unfortunately, due to pride. And so it was a win-win for everybody here. But Metropolitan Tikhon definitely very brave, and I mean this is a huge victory for recognition of course, Metropolitan Onufry in light of the full Ukrainian support of the schismatics. Like we're talking complete siding of Epiphany, inviting him to all the presidential dinners, all the meetings, all even when the U.S. ambassador is there with Zelensky, Epiphany is there on Zelensky's left right hand. He's there. He's as important as the local rabbis. He's lifted up, and of course we have the Patriarch Philaret, sort of dark, bizarre clown cardinal figure in the back as well. So Ukraine definitely, supporting all the anti-Orthodox elements within itself, and suddenly you have this American hierarch who is, super American, just traveled to Ukraine, and suddenly he just sides with the people who you've been ostracizing and discriminating against for 2 years plus now, at least even 8 years. Unfortunately, though, during I think his visit to the Pachayev Lavra, there was this strange, again, you can kind of completely understand it, and I think deeper analysis maybe is required in the future. But he did read a prayer for Ukrainian victory over Russia. Metropolitan Tikhon did. In terms of like for Ukrainian sovereignty, for a defense of the homeland, and it's just simply these prayers, they make zero sense in terms of analogies to Saint Nicholas of Japan. I think are a little bit far fetched here, because Japan wasn't persecuting Orthodox Christians during the Russo-Japanese War. At least nothing like we see in Ukraine at the moment, which is like just pure Satanism, probably equivalent only to the Bolsheviks, perhaps. Even I think Nazi Germany didn't go this far in terms of persecuting Orthodox Christians, and I don't even think they did persecute. They had political repressions and things like that. But this is really next level what we see over the last 2 years plus. And praying for Ukrainian victory, I think, is an unfortunate mark. But you can understand that from Metropolitan Tikhon's perspective, he is trying to at least, and perhaps this is that Jewish lawyer Amsterdam who advocates for Metropolitan Onufry before the UN and all these other places. And again, I'm not sure who this Mr. Amsterdam guy is, but he does seem to support Orthodox Christians. I mean, he is of Jewish origin. I'm a little bit suspicious, naturally, given my conspiratorial angle, but for now, he's been a positive mark, and I think he actually organized this trip of Metropolitan Tikhon to Ukraine, I think, in the first place. But yes, generally speaking, the visit has been positive. And unfortunately, just after Metropolitan Tikhon left, Pachayev Lavra, this is the second largest monastery in Ukraine, located in the west, so very far, close to Lvov. And one of the main arguments as to why Russia should liberate all of Ukraine is to free this big Pachayev Lavra monastery, which in the past itself has been harassed by Uniates, Catholics, and other dark anti-Christian elements in the past. Pachayev Lavra was visited by a commission of the Ukrainian Cultural Center. So the Ministry of Culture visited the Pachayev Lavra, similar to how it did in early 2023 before they took the Kiev Lavra monastery. So as you can see, they're going to assess the relics of the saints there, label them perhaps as these museum exponats, these museum pieces, and perhaps they'll even be turning the Pachayev Lavra into a museum similar to the Kiev-Pечерsk Lavra in the next few months. We'll have to see how that develops, but I think the Ukrainian regime was very unhappy about Metropolitan Tikhon's visit. So brave move by him. We'll see if he ends up visiting the EP, because Romania, Bulgaria, these are very, you can say, OG Orthodox countries, but will he be visiting the Patriarch of Constantinople? I think that'll be a curious thing to see, because again, the EP doesn't recognize the OCA as autocephalous. So we'll kind of see how that develops. But in terms of persecution, the craziest news, I mean, Metropolitan Arsenius of Svetogorsk Lavra has a court hearing this week again, so we need to pray for him. This is his, I think, long-term sentencing appeal. He's already appealed the initial trial. It didn't work. It fell through. Now I think this is his main sentencing trial taking place in Ukraine. And we see Metropolitan Theodosius who's being tried again. And we all saw that footage, Conrad, of him walking to court and the Ukrainian, I don't know, you can only describe them as being demonically possessed activists putting down a portrait of Patriarch Kirill and telling him to step over it. Mind you, Patriarch Kirill in the photograph, right, of the cloth that they put on the ground for him to walk over, it's almost like imagine doing this to a bishop first and foremost, even a bishop who's been renounced. An Orthodox Christian would never ever disrespect even a former bishop like that. This is just insane because we know in church when bishops walk in, they stand on the eagles, right? We do this in all Orthodox Christian churches. This is like a reverse of that. They're like, okay, you're walking to court like Christ went to judgment under Pontius Pilate. You're going to be walking over and standing on a portrait of Patriarch Kirill. You can see the symbolism here. These people are really like creative with some of the demonic ideas. But yes, Patriarch Kirill in the portrait, he is wearing, of course, an icon of the Theotokos of Christ around his neck on his medallion, the typical bishop medallion. And no Christian should be stepping on that. Even if Metropolitan Theodosius didn't like Patriarch Kirill and he had personal things against him, there's no reason why you should be stepping on even Patriarch. Even if we don't like Patriarch Bartholomew, we're never going to step on a photograph of him. That's just insane. It is completely outlandish, which shows the spirit of Ukraine, the ethics, as you said, Conrad, is not. There's nothing Christian about it. And he tried to step over it, and he did. He very much didn't step on the image of Patriarch Kirill. I mean, this is just horrible, horrible stuff. Something we can imagine, like, I don't know, is the Islamic persecution of Christians when they were asking Christians to walk over icons and step on them when they raided and invaded Georgia and some of these other places like Antioch. Stories you hear about from hundreds of years ago are being recreated in Eastern Europe today in 2024. True tragedy. But yeah, sort of a mixed bag of stories. I mean, this week, narratives regarding the persecution, which I think really shows that the situation is ever developing. It's very dynamic, and we need to pray for those currently facing the wrath of the anti-Christian forces there.
Yes, the disgusting images, what you described with Patriarch Kirill's face and whatnot. Again, people have their criticisms of Patriarch Kirill, but again, he's one of the only hierarchs talking about mass migration. He's, again, standing strong for his country. I have a lot of respect for him. So to see such a thing, again, like you said, Dimitri, it's one thing to say you don't like him or that you think even that the Moscow Patriarchate is somehow schismatic, but to then just do that, I mean, that's just like an anti-human activity, which I'm sure nobody participating in that is even really participates in OCU nonsense, let alone, the UOC. So, it's terrible to see. But speaking of, horrible situations in Russia, Scott Ritter and Andrew Napolitano, Judge Knapp, were prevented from going to Russia to participate in the St. Petersburg Forum, which is a big international relations foreign policy forum in St. Petersburg. I was talking to some people that are there right now, Pepe Escobar among others, and apparently Scott and Judge Knapp were taken off a plane by U.S. State Department. They had their passports taken, so really dramatic escalation there. Happening at the same time, our good friend Lucas Gage had New Jersey Homeland Security roll up on him just because he was taking Israel too hard to task on this Twitter account, which is just totally ridiculous. So be sure to listen to our interview with Lucas Gage, support him. He's doing great work against the Zionists and Zog and everything, but yeah, seeing Ritter and Napolitano stopped like that is crazy. I know that I have been to Russia. People, if you want to listen to the latest Q&A, I answer a question similar to this of if I think something like this could happen to me. So check that. It'll be linked below. Good episode of Ether Hour. We answer some great questions. But yeah, you know who didn't get stopped and is in St. Petersburg? Jackson Hinkle. So again, I'm not making any accusations. I'm not saying anything, but look, this guy glows a little bit. So I wish him the best. I don't want anything bad to happen to him. I'm not saying that I wish something had happened to him, but I'm just saying, Scott Ritter and Judge Knapp, some would argue that Jackson has a bigger audience than them. So interesting choice. But, I'll leave that to the internet detectives. But I guess unless you have anything else to say about Russia, Ukraine, we should probably talk about this Georgia situation because the Georgian Dream Party has done it. They have overridden President Salome, the globalist. They've overridden her veto of the foreign agent bill that requires any NGO or agency or organization that gets 20% or more of their funding from outside of Georgia to register with the government as a foreign agent, and all sorts of Soros entities and others activated against this. This was just intolerable. But the Georgian Dream Party used their 2/3 majority in parliament to override this. And now they're apparently even talking about passing a Russian-style anti-LGBT propaganda bill, which is fantastic. And Dimitri, I just want to know your thoughts on why Georgia seems to be, doing an about face so suddenly and turning to the right side of things. The West claims that it's because of Russian influence, but between the SMO and the continued soft wars between Russia and Georgia, I don't think the Georgian people have somehow become pro-Russian. I think this is, as far as I'm aware, just a true nationalist rejection of the globalist process, because the EU and America have claimed that they're going to stop supporting Georgia for EU status. They're going to stop supporting them for all of these international community things. But I think we're literally witnessing in real time a triumph of, church and blood and soil over Zog and over the tentacles of globalism.
You know what's interesting is I was listening to the Russian-speaking Georgian right-wing politician, former member of the Georgian parliament. He's a pretty, I would say, conservative man, and very Russophilic, but also pro-Georgian and nationalistic in that perspective. And he's saying that Georgians completely reject the LGBTQ liberal cultural agenda, but still are very pro-European because they don't see themselves as in any way related to some of these other people in the Caucasus Mountains. They see them as somewhat barbaric. And, I agree, Georgia has been, it's perhaps the one of the oldest Christian countries. Like, yes, Georgia is not ruled by a monarchy today, which is one of its shortcomings. It is very much the liberal order set up in the post Nicholas II, sort of Georgia separating from the Russian Empire regime, right? Which, the Georgian president Salome actually hails from. Her ancestors were those liberal Georgians who, after the Russian Revolution, moved to France, and that's why she has these French roots. Very interesting there. So that's the Georgian French connection, is that after the Russian Revolution, a lot of the Georgian libs, who ran away from the Marxists and the Bolsheviks and didn't fight them, moved to France. And now they've moved back, of course, in the 1990s. So President Salome, of course, she's been completely shut down by the Georgian Dream Party. And Georgia, yes, it's, according to Levan Pirveli, as well as some of these other Georgian analysts, Georgia still sees itself as a part of Europe. As strange as that may seem, the average person, and they see Europe as a failing sort of Christian civilization, which they can perhaps bring some life into. So they see themselves as this hopeful, perhaps Viktor Orban-esque a country like Hungary, or like perhaps even now that Vucic and Dodik have combined forces and perhaps they're pushing this Balkan reignition of Christianity there in the south, they do see themselves as members of that former, perhaps 1950s-esque Europe, like the Western Bloc type Europe. So Georgia is in a very strange situation because, as you said, Conrad, they're not Russo. The country itself is not Russophilic, but it still sees itself as a member of this European family. But it doesn't want to be hyper liberal. It doesn't want to be LGBTQ. It's a strange place to be. And I mean, Russia was in this particular position during Putin's first presidential term between 1999 and 2003, when I think some of Putin's strangest interviews and some of his weirdest speeches can be found, where he's just like speaking to the UN and saying Russia is a member of the New World Order. And I mean, not in those words, but basically saying that Russia joined NATO and stuff like that. It's just strange statements. Georgia is still making those particular claims, except it doesn't want the extra stuff, right? It wants to eat the Big Mac burger from McDonald's, but it doesn't want the GMO. But unfortunately, it's baked into the cake. I think that's what the Georgian people will realize very shortly. But yes, and the West, it seems, they're not able to realpolitik the situation, to approach it from a right-wing, pragmatic, realist perspective in international relations. They're standing strong on the fact that if you want to be a member of our commune, of our community, you will need to accept these degenerate values. And I think you have people like Patriarch Ilya praying the Georgian nation away from the degeneracy, essentially. Can you imagine just the level of piety that's moving this mass of people, like literally dispelling and exercising the demons of liberalism from a nation itself? I mean, it's one of the first examples of that taking place. Perhaps it will still take place in Russia eventually, when that fifth column will be washed away and Russia will emerge as this really powerful, hyper-Orthodox, you can say Orthodox Christian supremacist nation in the future. But at this point, we're seeing a sort of cultural revival in Georgia itself. But yes, Georgia still sees itself as not Russia-dominated Orthodox Christian country, as a member of Europe, although officially not in the EU and officially not in NATO, and it still wants to be a part of that group. But its ties to France, I think, are the biggest connection here. So still very close ties to France. And the question will be, will Macron impose these liberal values on the Georgian people after they've outwardly, expressly, pushed them aside? So I think that'll be the pressure. And President Salome, I think, I'm not sure if she'll be winning the next election. I know Georgia has a tradition of, Saint Tamara, the Queen of Georgia, but President Salome is not this female great Christian leader that they're trying to make her out to be. Like, I get it. Georgia has a tradition of really great women leaders in the past, but they were Orthodox queens, you know, tsaritsas, princesses. They were not presidents elected in a post-French Revolutionary Masonic fashion. I think that needs to be understood. All Orthodox Christians already know that by default, but sometimes that needs to be reiterated. So I do have hope for Georgia, but yeah, it is. Georgia is a very key country in the Southern Caucasus, Conrad, even more than Armenia. Now, mind you, Armenia has been this almost non-entity for the last 300 years. No offense to Armenian people, but the country of Armenia was manipulated very highly during the Ottoman Empire, and even in the post-Ottoman world, they were a pawn in the hands of massive players such as Persia, Iran, of course, Turkey, and even the Russian Empire used anti-Ottoman Armenian sentiments in order to bolster up a resistance to the Ottomans in the Southern Caucasus. But Georgia was always very much a country, steeped, these valleys are very deep in Georgian tradition. Georgia is an actual strong, united entity which has never been displaced. The Georgian people were never genocided, never moved away from their homeland. They are very much enrooted. You cannot bring in millions of immigrants into Georgia. They will, for lack of a better word, they will chimp out. The Georgian people are very much a player in this Caucasus game, and perhaps in the future, Christians can rely on them too as a balance against. It isn't Azerbaijan versus Armenia in so much as it is perhaps the rising Turkic belt, Conrad, which we spoke about, and Georgia. Perhaps that is the counterweight here. So I think that's just a hopeful sort of long-term prognosis.
Yeah, I pretty much agree there, and I think regarding Georgia slipping back into rather away from the globalist sphere, they will then be treated as if they're in the Russo sphere, even if, they're not really, as influenced by Russia as they will realize. So they might just realize that and be like, maybe we should just re-enter the Russo sphere and the church can help resolve the Abkhazia, South Ossetia issues, and all of that can, get sorted out peacefully. But before we return to America and talk about the obvious developments there with Trump, and I want to talk about Thomas Massey on Tucker Carlson talking about APAC, we have some big things going on in the Balkans, a similar, kind of pulling back, towards the traditional homeland away from, the globalist clutches is occurring right now in the Republic of Srpska. Milorad Dodik, the president there, he recently, it was happened just after his 5th visit with Putin since the SMO began. He said that they've announced that there will be a referendum in Srpska on independence and leaving Bosnia and Herzegovina, that federation. I don't think it includes rejoining Serbia. I think that would have to be a different referendum, but the fact that this is happening is a pretty big deal. I wanted to read the direct quote here. Dodik said, "The Republic of Srpska will hold a referendum on its independence from Bosnia and Herzegovina. We would like to do it now, but there are 2 other parties involved on this issue, the Croats and the Bosniaks. So of course it takes time. Our task now is to start the negotiation process." And this comes, a few days, almost exactly a week after the government appointed a working group to draft an agreement on the peaceful separation of the Republic of Srpska from the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina. The government of the Republic of Srpska will then propose this agreement to the National Assembly. And this is all within Republic of Srpska. They're not asking the Bosnian, legislature, whatever that is at this point, their permission. They're not asking Christian Schmidt. They're doing this on their own. So it's great to see, and obviously they have support from Vucic, clearly, who is probably giving support for this in the aftermath of the Srebrenica nonsense, vote that you guys discussed in the previous episode. GSP and Dimitri, you guys did a good job analyzing that. But, this is great to see from Srpska. Do you have any quick thoughts on this, Dimitri?
Only that Milorad Dodik should defend himself, right? There were alleged claims that Putin was wearing a defensive vest when appearing in public in recent weeks after the FICO assassination attempt, and of course the AFD politician as well being stabbed. There are really dark forces at play here. And Milorad Dodik does seem to be the personification of Republika Srpska, the Serbian people's secession from this Bosnian post-1990s regime, the hegemony that they've set up there in the I would say post-Yugoslavian world. So he does need to protect himself. I think there are really dark patsies out, and we do know from even the assassination of Karl Ferdinand, the Black Hand, right? They do use Freemasonic, these dark, you can say, mind control people to assassinate and take hits out on people, essentially do these suicide runs. and commit terrorist acts. So Milorad Dodik does need to protect himself because at this point they're viewing him as a new Lukashenko, potentially future Putin, and he even appears more dangerous and more driven than somebody like Vucic. So even perhaps Vucic sees him as a competitor in the sense, but I think Vucic really shouldn't do that. He should cooperate with Dodik, and together they can drive Russia forward. Because similar to how I would say Putin and Lukashenko are moving Russia and Belarus towards a brighter future in Eastern Europe, so could the Balkans and the southern Slavs move forward with these two leaders, and obviously the brains behind the operation, all those brave Orthodox Christians and serving under them and also for them, assisting them, to ministers, the public servants, the volunteers, and the people who are actually participating in Serbian politics to the greatest extent, given the fact that they are quite limited in this democratic liberal system where you have to vote for everything and you have to pass things through certain audits. But still, Milorad Dodik, I think, has a very bright future ahead of him. I hope the secession works, and it is a Donetsk-Lugansk type situation. So, and I don't think Bosnia itself has the capacity militarily to even stop the secession taking place. So it'll be very interesting to see how this develops.
Yeah, rip Bosnia and Herzegovina. It had a good 30 plus year run or something as a country, maybe less. I don't know the exact dates, but at least I have the BIH, Bosnia and Herzegovina stamp on my passport. So it'll go away, but the memories will be there forever, right? But the situation in the US, I just wanted to make sure that we cover this because technically, I guess one of the biggest news stories around the world, but Trump has been convicted of a felony, 34 counts of, I guess, falsifying documents of some kind. It's really total nonsense. It has to do with the Stormy Daniels crap with his Jewish lawyer, Michael Cohen. It's just, even talking about the details, I start to fall asleep. But, they got some bunch of retards in Manhattan to sit on a jury. They would have convicted Trump for anything. I guess people briefly thought there was one juror that like browsed X and Truth Social that they were gonna, do something, but I think that was probably just fake news. But yeah, Trump's been convicted. Obviously, this has affected nothing in his polling. If anything, it's made his polling go up in some capacity. But this just ties in with my previous analysis of the Israel thing. I mean, this is all going to coincide precisely. Obviously, his sentencing is July 11th, so that's 3 days before the Republican National Convention, where he would officially become the Republican nominee. So there's a small chance that some rhino type people will try to stage a small coup and get somebody else on the ballot at the last minute, but I don't think that's going to happen. Trump will probably announce his vice president at the RNC as well, so we'll be looking for that. But at the end of the day, the big thing about this, and I mentioned this in the Q&A, is that, if this had happened any other time, people would have cared a lot more. But even with all of this happening, this election is still less intense and less politicized than 2020 and 2016. And a lot of that has to do with what's going on in Israel, the fact that neither of the two parties or the two candidates, significantly disagree on the issue. Obviously Trump is courting all the big Jewish donors, Miriam Adelson, we discussed that earlier. But again, this is one of those things where I kind of agree with Nick Fuentes a bit that, Trump, his latest appearances with Dr. Phil and Hannity have been so awful that even in the midst of the unprecedented persecution, the hardcore MAGA people, like, he's going to have to come out with some better policy to really secure some of these votes because not that this really matters. I think Trump is going to win regardless. I'm probably still going to vote for him. Again, I think all of this he's going to win. It's going to be a big worldwide situation. He's going to swoop into the election with victory right as Israel's in its darkest hour. I think this is going to be, it's almost like a script. Some could say it was planned this way. Maybe I can get into that in a future Q&A or something. But it's quite an interesting development to say the least. But that being said, it's crazy how, not to say I don't care, I do care, but it's weird. I feel like I should care a lot more based on what's going on. But I guess all this stuff has been dragged out for so long in the super tired media cycle, and we've been hearing about this forever, that these kind of things almost happen before they happen, I guess you could say.
Yeah, but look, I think Trump's policy ideas are very interesting. It'll be really curious, Connor, to see how they play out with, say, the New Mexican president who was elected, who happens to have Jewish heritage, a wonderful Claudia Sheinbaum. And of course, now not only do we have a Jewish, a Jewish perhaps, we did see her with a Kabbalah bracelet. And again, these people are like, well, they wear the Kabbalah bracelet on the left or the right hand. Really, you guys think that these pagan rituals have a sort of like a specific meaning? I'm sure there's various cults and all these subcultural contexts there. So, but yes, The Mexican president now has been elected, and it's a Jewish woman. So I wonder how Trump's attitude towards the migrants from South America will, of course, interact with that. Because again, we know the cartels are deeply run. Every cartel has a Jewish accountant. They do launder their money through Jewish banks, things like that. There are these deep interactions. The cartels are not just purely Mexican banditry, sort of gone rogue on a large scale. No, it is, of course, controlled opposition in Mexico, controlled chaos, you can say, in order to divide and, of course, demoralize the Native American population. By Native American, I mean literally white American people, not just the Indians walking around with feathers and living on plantations and running casinos. I mean the actual white American people. And so not only does it demoralize the Catholics in Mexico, but it demoralizes the Protestant American or Orthodox population in the South American states, such as Texas, so just north of the Mexican border. And I think it's a really big concern. Hopefully, Trump, if he does fail in the foreign policy and in terms of his attitude towards Israel won't change, perhaps he will at least be patriotic in the sense that, well, the wall still needs to be built. There is still a massive asylum seeker refugee crisis. They do call themselves asylum seekers and refugees. If so, as we know, according to international law, they should remain in Mexico, which is a safe haven. It is a safe country. They could remain in Mexico safe and sound. They do not need to move further north in order to seek asylum. So again, the disingenuous sort of wave of these caravans of migrants are always a threat, I think, to American national integrity. But again, just sort of moving towards the migrant question, if Trump fails on the foreign policy, and perhaps he will at least force Zelensky to bow down, right? We do know Zelensky, now that he isn't a re-elected figure, Zelensky has met up with the King of Norway, King of Sweden. The minor royal houses of Europe have recognized him, but will this King of America, Donald Trump, recognize Zelensky? That is another question altogether, right? Because again, apparently there's a lot more Jewish presidents in the world than just Netanyahu, it seems. And I think Trump's relationship with them will be very curious because he has his own, son-in-law, the Jewish prince Jared Kushner. So it'll be curious to see once he does win, inevitably, I agree with you, Conrad, there's no competition, how he interacts with these overseas Jewish leaders, including, of course, I think Milei from Argentina. So very, very interesting developments there. But I think on the subject of migrants, Conrad, the recent attacks in Germany and just some of the horrendous footage we've been seeing, it accentuates the main talking point we started the day with, which is chaos in the Middle East. It forces some poor people, but also very malicious elements to move into Europe and cause disruption amongst the culture. You can say culturally Christian, but I'm sure some of these people in Europe are actually genuinely believing Protestants, Catholics, and Orthodox Christians, causing mischief and chaos on European soil. I think it's really tragic news about what took place, but also a little bit hilarious because there was a dark comedic aspect to it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure people have seen the memes at this point of what happened in Mannheim with the migrant attack was this, German anti-Islamic activist was, I don't know if he was going to burn a Quran or something, but he was, you see these things in the Germanic countries. He was spouting off against Islam like one does, like one has the right to do. And then this 25-year-old Afghan comes out with this big knife and starts stabbing the guy. And then the police come in and start arresting the guy that was speaking for some reason instead of the guy attacking with the knife. And then the guy attacking with the knife then stabs and like slits the police officer's throat, and the police officer has since died. He was 29 years old. So a real tragedy. And I believe even since then, another machete attack has taken place in the German city of Mannheim. Since this initial attack occurred a few days ago, I believe, like you mentioned, there was an AfD politician that was attacked. So, this is all getting a bit ridiculous in Germany at this point. At the same time, the song, Ausländer raus is becoming, the dance hall hit of the summer, which we love to see, obviously. But people are getting arrested for singing a song that says foreigners out. And meanwhile, the police, while a foreigner is stabbing a German person, are incapable of arresting the foreigner still and arrest the German person. It's a pretty insane reality that we're witnessing right now. But obviously, I don't know if this is going to be used to fuel some kind of pro-Israel sentiment. The AfD is pretty solid on at least, I think their mainstream wing is obviously pro-Israel, but it's clear that at least 40 to 50% of the AfD, I mean, these are true nationalists. I don't want to do them any disservice by saying this, but this is the spirit of Hitler. This is where it went. This is this is the real deal. So the AfD, the Bjorn Haka, who's the leader of like the conservative-based nationalist wing of the AfD, the regional Thuringia party, that's where he is empowered. He said, It's like the Weimar era. This is often said today in view of the polarization, but the subtle difference is that only one side uses violence offensively and continuously and is spared by the authorities and the media. It is the left-wing side. Mannheim is the proof of this new Weimar. Escalation by Islamists, escalation by Antifa. We will have to put an end to both now for the safety of all citizens. So, God bless Bjorn Haka, even posting something like that, knowing that your party is under federal investigation, you could basically get arrested any day. So it's brave, but the people of Germany have finally had enough. Ausländer Raus is just a populist call at this point. I think these German elections will probably see AfD maybe even win. And we'll see if, repatriatization and mass deportations are politically possible in Europe. Because if there's one thing the stabbing shows, it's that we need those immediately. Obviously, we see the Reform Party doing well in England now that Farage has stepped up to the plate. And you mentioned Mexico, Dimitri. I don't know too much about Claudia Sheinbaum, but what are there, like 40,000 Jews in all of Mexico, with a country of, 120, 140 plus million people or something? Pretty ridiculous. But, that's how it works. So it's an interesting, we'll see how she does. I don't know all the details. I know she's from like the far left faction. So it's going to be interesting. Maybe we'll have Hervoje Morich on to discuss that a little bit more. But the other things going on stateside, of course, are Thomas Massie. He went on Tucker Carlson's show and they had a fantastic discussion where Massie basically just exposed that every single Republican congressman except him has an APAC handler. Every single one has told him, I'll get back to you with my APAC guy. They all have their APAC guy from their constituency somewhere where, they serve as a congressman that calls them up and makes sure that they're all plugged in with the Jews at AIPAC so they can win every dang election and vote right on Israel. But Thomas Massie is the only Republican that votes correctly and isn't a slave to AIPAC. And it's pretty brave to go on one of the biggest podcasts / shows and really say this because, people have been killed for less. We're seeing what's happening to these Boeing whistleblowers. We know what happened to other people that went against Israel in the past. So it's quite impressive to see.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, it's really good having a congressman who actually, stands up for the truth and doesn't bow down to this sort of power. In other countries, there's similar people. Like we do know Igor Strelkov had sort of political ambitions, but he's still in prison. And by the way, the bad news, I guess, related to him as sort of a right-wing figurehead, potential maybe even successor to Putin in some sort of hypothetical futuristic scenario where Russia wins the SMO and possibly goes forward further, is the fact that Strelkov's appeal was denied. He still has not joined that volunteer brigade that was created for him in Donetsk, and Strelkov, his appeal actually in June was denied. So he's still in prison tentatively for another 4 years. Very unfortunate news. We're not sure what the heck the judicial branch of the Russian Federation and the prosecutors are doing there. But definitely, as you said, you've described these APAC handlers, these people who American politicians need to answer to. I'm sure in Ukraine it's even much deeper. We can see this Zelensky traveling abroad for 2 weeks, and there's no uprising, there's no revolt. In Ukraine is so heavily controlled by these essentially CIA handlers that, it is just it's the reality these days, Conrad. It seems that if you do want to become a politician, and some of these Q&A questions we received in our recent A4 Hour episode, which I think everybody should check out, the Q&A was quite good. The question was, how should Orthodox Christians approach politics? And, the answer you'll see in the video itself, but this answers it, is not to get in bed, so to speak, colloquially speaking, not to handcuff yourself to these Jewish interests. Do not take Israeli money. Do not become tied at the hip. Do not collaborate with these anti-Christian elements in the first place, because eventually this lobbying money will make you enslaved. It'll yoke you to this foreign interest, you can say. And even if these foreigners live in America and they're sort of American citizens and their ancestors were American, you do know at some point they did move there from the Pale of Settlement, and their ideas of America are very different to yours. So I think any sort of American politician should keep that in mind. And Thomas Macy, I think he's very much awake, and he's doing it in a very politically correct sense, similar to Nicholas J. Fuentes, who has recently been unbanned on X Twitter, and now he's noticed the way he's speaking. It's very controlled. He doesn't want to fall under the ban hammer again, and his message is reaching thousands of people around the world. And myself and you, Conrad, we see that as relevant because, that is the message. That message completely resonates with us Orthodox Christians, because if we had a larger voice online, we would definitely be saying very similar things. And in fact, we do say similar things. So, hey, here we have somebody who we could use as an ally, and in fact, we do find ourselves collaborating with such people. I think this is a step forward for conservatives and Christian Europeans and Americans going forward.
I completely agree, and Fuentes' analysis on this has been very good. He made the very apt point, and I think I've said this on the show, obviously, in the past, but what we're seeing in America is a specific branch of world Jewry, the left-wing faction, the open society faction, securing, you could call the world, the goyim, the nations for the Jews. They are allowing for an open society, a society that rejects any kind of ethnic homogeneity outside of the Jewish community, rejects any kind of religious exclusivity or zeal, outside of the Jewish religion or the secular religion. It ensures that, people are toxically individualistic, that there can be no communities because, they view any kind of community or nation that is cohesive in that way behind Christianity, behind, specifically Europeans, obviously, they view that as a potential enemy that can turn on them and do another Holocaust or whatever propaganda is that they say. And you listen to people's names in these countries, Chuck Schumer, not Nancy Pelosi is not Jewish, but, Chuck Schumer, some of these other characters, they sound a little bit more familiar, but, like Thomas Massey says, they're a foreign government, they may be American citizens, but they are ultimately an alien people. And then you go back over to Israel, and, obviously that group I was just mentioning, the left-wing people, they control the Democrat Party for the most part in America. And then you go to Israel and you learn who controls the Republican Party, who, while their constituency in America may be socially conservative, pro-life, isolationist, the MAGA crowd, the Republican Party exists in practice because the right-wing faction of world Jewry uses them to secure Israel. The left-wing faction secures the nations of the world, and the right-wing, nationalist Zionists secure Israel. And you go over there and they have names, like Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, which if I didn't know that he was the finance minister of Israel, I'd guess that's a demon from the Bible or like a demon from Paradise Lost or Dante's Inferno or something like that. But no, he's just the finance minister of Israel, ultra Zionist hardliner. So you got to realize that, these people, they're on each other's team, and then we're on our team. There's Jesus's team, which is, Christians, the Orthodox Church, and then there's the anti-Jesus team, and that's these characters that control both parties in the U.S. And while they may seem to disagree on some things, ultimately they are still on the same team. So I think that's an important message we like to hammer home here on the show. And now, one of them is also apparently the president of Mexico, and they're about to bankroll the future president of the United States. So it's a serious situation, the issue that is world Jewry and Zionism, and understanding it and getting canceled, and we have to dance around the issue even on this show here on Substack. You can't just come out and say it as strongly as you may like, although I think we do a pretty good job on the show. But Dimitri, with all of that, do you have anything else we may have missed before we wrap this up here? This has been a good packed week.
Yeah, super packed week. And I think my closing thoughts are just that with Donald Trump's re-election in November of this year, which is only 4.5 months away, 5 months away, we do need to consider the fact that if President Trump wins, he may be the president which oversees World War III breakout into a massive hot war, like hotter than it is now. It'll turn into a world fire, and that's very interesting. I mean, I didn't expect this to come, and that's unless they, of course, take Donald Trump out during his presidency, or if he doesn't make it to November, December, and of course the inauguration in January. But we will see Donald Trump kind of oversee this entire thing, which is why, as you've stated, Conrad, it is very concerning his connections to Israel, both in terms of lobbying money support from the Republicans, of course, who are being lobbied by Israel and AIPAC, and also family connections to Jared Kushner, this weird Antichrist type character who I'm sure he's not the Antichrist, but the fact that he acts like it, right, is already concerning. Just the rabbinical type LARP that these people go through. They do see themselves as a mini Moshiach in its own dark sense. And so that is concerning, that we'd wish America to be on the right side in this coming war, but it does seem like it's very much joke. These people are still holding the reins, and they may drive the American country into, just like the Pharaoh drove the Egyptian army into the Red Sea. I feel like America may be driven into a conflict which it will not come out of united. It will decimate the American population and country, and even American culture. Perhaps America will reemerge stronger, more Christian, more conservative. But yes, World War III will, I think, definitely potentially take place under Trump's presidency, which is very, very scary and somewhat unexpected. But it won't be the sort of, I think, demented Joe Biden who was pooping himself on stage in France, sort of handling this particular matter. I think they'll have a strong man like Donald Trump, and who knows what kind of dark characters will be whispering into his ears, just like that, just like into the ears of King Theoden from Lord of the Rings, right? whatever they do to Trump, I think he needs to remain independent, sober, and level-headed, and perhaps tap into those all those Christians who are actually praying for him to make the right choices.
No, I totally agree. And we got to wrap this up. We could talk about a few more things. Be sure to follow us on the social media. We're going to be posting about the upcoming election of the future patriarch of Bulgaria. Got to hope that the pro UOC anti schismatic candidate wins. But to follow us, be sure to follow us here on Substack, obviously, worldwarnow.co, worldwarnow.substack.com. That link also works. That is our home base. That is where everything gets posted initially every ether hour, initially every episode of World War Now a full day early. And of course, you can subscribe for free and get every episode in your email inbox, as well as getting behind the paywall and getting all 40 plus episodes of our premium show Ether Hour that covers some of the most interesting things you're going to find anywhere. We talk about the land of Chud. We talk about space being fake. We talk about the Holy Land. We talk about uncanonized saints in the Orthodox Church. So check all of that out. Follow us on Twitter, on X, World War Now _. That's one of our most active places, as is our Telegram, World War Now Telly. Follow me on Twitter at GnomeRad. Follow Dimitri at OCanonist. Follow us on Rumble, World War Now. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. If you're not subscribed on both the Substack and the YouTube channel, you're a fake fan. So like the YouTube videos, leave comments on both. We love engaging with the comments. We're also maybe looking for some new music for the intros to the Q&A episodes of Ether Hours. So, check that out. We have some new artwork as well that's going to be on the YouTube version. So check all of that out. Leave a comment. Let us know your thoughts if you have any ideas. But yeah, with all of that, thank you so much for listening this week, everybody. World War III rages on. But thank you again for listening to all of our supporters. You're the ones that make all of this possible. And with all of that, God bless. We'll see you next time.